So we're at a point now where the Alter Rebbe has spoken about Teshuvah, and he's spoken about the fact that we understand there are two realities that a person could find themselves in. You could find yourself in the reality called Kedusha, which is ideal. That's where we're supposed to be. Kedusha means that a person is aligned with what Hashem wants, and a person is effectively doing what the Torah expects. That's a place of holiness. We did define in the previous chapter that in order for something to be holy, it has to submit to Hashem. That's really the key factor of holiness, is the ability of an individual or an item or a topic or a concept to be able to completely surrender itself to Hashem. The opposite of that, which is what we call klippa, is where something becomes self-interested and self-absorbed. And so instead of having a higher purpose and being aligned with what Hashem wants, this would be something or someone who just cares about themselves. And then we said that there are actually two kinds of klippa. There's the kind of klippa that can be rehabilitated. It's called klippas noiga. That means something which the Torah permits, but a person doesn't engage with it necessarily with the best intentions. So that's not a healthy place to be, but it's easy to fix. It's easy to get out of there because you just realign yourself and you're good to go. And then we said that there is something which is called absolute klippa, and that's where a person gets completely swallowed and absorbed and stuck in an environment that is very unhealthy, completely spiritually toxic, and it's not so easy to get out. And initially, when we learned about it, we said the only way out is Mashiach has to come. So Mashiach has to rescue the person from that situation. The person got sucked down and chained into that particular situation, and you need Mashiach to save you. Or we said a person could do what is called Teshuvah Gedoyla, this great advanced level of Teshuvah, which is so powerful and so compelling that it can transform even the most negative experience into something positive. And we ended off last week effectively understanding that Teshuvah mi ahava, that this is Teshuvah which is propelled by love. So when a person is driven to realign themselves because they love Hashem so much, so that's going to bring them to a state where everything that was bad and everything that was inappropriate and everything that was negative is now no longer baggage, it's actually propellant. That's actually what gets me moving in the right direction. And we spent a fair amount of time talking about Teshuvah mi'ahava. So what we're going to talk about this evening is as follows. Number one, we're going to go back and just recontrast that again with regular Teshuvah and explain that regular Teshuvah does not have such a massive impact as Teshuvah which is based on love would have. So that's one thing we're going to look at. And then we're going to have the opportunity to slay our dragons. Now, the truth is that when I mentioned in the topic for this evening that we're going to learn about slaying our dragons, I don't know what kind of Disney or romantic picture you had in your mind at that particular point in time. But the truth of the matter is it's not going to sound so romantic at all. And he's going to be speaking about a specific kind of misbehavior, a specific kind of a toxic spiritual behavior that causes a lot of trouble, a lot more trouble than people would imagine, and has to have a particular way to fix it. Okay, so that's really what we're going to be speaking about this evening. So if you have the Tanya book in front of you, you're looking at page 30. And page 30, it is 9 lines from the bottom of the page. The first word on the line is the word aval. If you're looking at the screen, well, then it's the first word on the screen. Okay, aval. But teshuvah sheloi mi'ahavozoi, if a person is motivated to do teshuvah, but the drive for that teshuvah is not this overwhelming, incredibly powerful love of God. That's not what's propelling them to do the teshuvah. So why is the person doing teshuvah? I don't know, because they feel guilty, because they don't want to lose out on their relationship with Hashem, because they're afraid of what consequences might face them if they don't do teshuvah. Whatever the motivation is, as long as the motivation is not deep, meaningful, powerful love of Hashem, af shehi teshuvah nechoina, even though that teshuvah is absolutely acceptable. And I think that that's really important for us to understand, that you could have teshuvah which is 100% acceptable. It's good, it's fine, Hashem is okay with you, you're okay with Hashem, you've restored the connection. You know, it's like if your internet goes down or your power goes off. So you grumble and mumble about it, but as soon as the utility reconnects you, okay, Hashem yislach loi, as we're about to read. You forgive them. It happened. It happened once. I suppose if it happens on a daily basis and it happens multiple times a day, well, maybe you're not going to be so forgiving anymore. But that's also because of the limitations of the human experience. Hashem doesn't have those limitations. Hashem is infinite. Hashem has the capacity to forgive and to forgive and to forgive again. But the point is that if a person does teshuvah, which fits into the requirements of teshuvah, so you tick the boxes, you say, Hashem wants me to have remorse, I have remorse. Hashem wants me to verbalize what I did wrong, I verbalize what I did wrong. Hashem wants me to make a resolution never to repeat it, I make the resolution never to repeat it. So I've now done teshuvah that qualifies as teshuvah. It's called teshuvah nechoina. That is considered proper teshuvah. Va Hashem yislach loi. And Hashem will forgive you. So now you got to ask yourself this question. What's my goal? What's my objective? What do I need to achieve? Is my goal not to be in trouble anymore? You're like the school child. So you did something wrong and now the parents are angry or the principal is angry or the teacher has given you detention. So what does the school child want? I just want to not be in trouble anymore. Now that's the motivation. That's called teshuvah nechoina. I'm sorry for what I did. I apologize verbally. And I say I'm not going to repeat it again. And Hashem says, okay, that's fine. That's acceptable. You're no longer in trouble. This is no longer going to be held against you. But as we have already discussed quite in detail, if a person does teshuvah just purely to remove the negative, well, that's not good enough. Because at the end of the day, you fell in the mud, your clothes are still dirty. At the end of the day, the person did something, the impact is still there. So we'd like to do more than that, and that's why we want a higher level of teshuvah which is driven by love. And the teshuvah which is driven by love will turn the whole thing around. But regular teshuvah, mikol mokom loy na'asu loy kezochiyos. As long as a person has only performed teshuvah, and I say only quite liberally, because let's be honest, even to get to this point of proper teshuvah, that's a big challenge. To truly regret what we've done wrong. You know what the Rambam says? The Rambam says that you know that you've done teshuvah only when you reach a point where you face the same temptation, under the same circumstances, with the same drive, and you say no because you're doing teshuvah. So that's not so simple, and it's not necessarily something that everybody will achieve. But the point we're making here is, and even if a person reaches that incredible level of teshuvah, still, loy nasu loy kazochiyos. That teshuvah, it will clean the slate. It will not transform and convert the negative energy to now become credits. For that, a person needs love. And therefore, ve'ein oilim mehaklipa legamre. Therefore, the action and the behavior that got completely stuck and trapped in the world of impurity cannot get out. Cannot get out. Until Mashiach comes. And the time where, as we say, for those people who listen to the English that they say at a Shiva house, until death will be swallowed up. What does it say? Death will be swallowed up for all eternity. Death is also a metaphor for spiritual shall we say, toxic behavior. And the reason for that is because in order to be truly alive, one has to be connected to Hashem. The Torah tells us, as it says, "V'atem hadveikim b'Hashem Elokeichem." Those of you who are bound to Hashem, your God, chayim kulchem hayoim, you are alive. So the corollary is that if a person has a detachment from Hashem, God forbid, then the person is not really alive. So bila hamavis, that's why it uses this expression. Okay, so let's understand what's going on over here. So if a person does teshuvah, and it's an acceptable form of teshuvah, but it's not with that enthusiasm, that incredible cascading love of Hashem, then what they do is clear the slate. They're no longer in trouble, but they haven't yet reached a point where they can extricate themselves out of the impurity. Why? Because the only way a person can extricate themselves out of the impurity is only to redefine it. So let's just understand exactly what that means. Let's say that you've got a person, God forbid, and it's an extreme example, but let's just use it because unfortunately it is a common example. Let's say that you have a person who, God forbid, has a serious health scare. And let's be more specific. Let's say that, God forbid, a person has a heart attack. And Baruch Hashem, they're They go through whatever processes, medical processes they have to go through, and they're okay now. They have a full recovery. What comes to that full recovery is a bit of a lecture from the doctor. And the doctor says, okay, you're going to have to make some lifestyle changes now. Perhaps the food that you've been eating, the cholesterol-rich food, maybe that's got to go. And maybe if the person was smoking, the doctor will say, you can't smoke anymore. And then, of course, without question, the doctor's going to tell this person, and you need to start to do some physical exercise, because that's part of the problem. Your body is not as healthy as it should be. Now, one of two things could happen. One patient could walk out of there and take the prescription medication that they were given, the blood thinners or whatever the particular thing is that they were given. They could take that prescription medication for the rest of their lives and never have another heart attack. Have they done teshuvah? Have they done teshuvah? Well, kind of. They basically created a system to protect themselves from ever landing up in such a life-threatening situation ever again, God forbid. But the heart attack was a bad chapter in their life, and the period following the heart attack where they take the necessary medication is a better chapter in their life. Then you get a different kind of patient. This patient sees the heart attack as a wake-up call. And as a direct result of that heart attack, they completely modify their life. Not only that they start to exercise and they start to eat healthier, but they also start to prioritize things differently and spend more time with their family or invest more in personal growth and spirituality and their connection to God and so on and so forth. Because suddenly they realize that life is not to be taken for granted. That is no longer a heart attack that was a bad chapter in the person's life. That becomes a story where the person says that the heart attack was one of the best chapters of their life. It was the first sentence of the best chapter. It wasn't the end of a bad chapter. It was the beginning of a new chapter. So now they no longer look at the heart attack as the worst thing that happened to them, but rather as the best thing that happened to them. So that's the difference between regular teshuvah and teshuvah that is driven by love. Regular teshuvah says, I have now put an end to a terrible period of my life. And teshuvah out of love says, I am now seeing that what I did, these terrible mistakes that I made and these poor decisions and my bad judgment and whatever the case is, that is now the launch pad for the best period of my life. Well, in that case, there is no death anymore. There is no negativity anymore. You've redefined the entire experience. What was previously poison is now the elixir of life. So that's the ultimate kind of teshuvah, and with that we're going to end this conversation. So it was a very important conversation. It's probably one of the most profound insights that we'll ever have into teshuvah. It's something we should revisit from time to time, just to remind ourselves. And now we're going to go to a different scenario, very interesting scenario. So because this chapter deals with various cases of how a person could expose themselves to spiritually toxic energy and then what they can do to recover from it, so we're going to talk about a fairly common exposure to negative energy. So up until now, we've spoken about food. That was the one classic example that we used. We used food. And we said there's a difference between kosher food that a person eats with bad intentions versus non-kosher food, and how the kosher food is easy to rehabilitate and the non-kosher food really drags us and sucks us down, and we need a very major intervention in order to turn things around. But we also mentioned, and we possibly glossed over this, and maybe it was even intentional, but we also mentioned that one of the most toxic behaviors that a person can engage in is inappropriate relations. So any kind of relationship that the Torah forbids, if a person engages in that relationship, it's a very, very heavy spiritual decline. Because yes, food is a very important part of who we are, and food becomes part of our system. So the food that we eat is absorbed into our bloodstream and becomes the nutrition that actually runs our body. And so therefore, whatever food we're putting into our system has to be so carefully vetted. And people forget the profound bond and connection that an intimate relationship creates. You know, it's interesting. Probably the best example that we have in the Torah of a person who was able to stop themselves and reverse their behavior in the intensity of passion, who would be the icon of that? Would be Joseph, right? Yosef. Right? Yosef HaTzadik. What's the story of Yosef HaTzadik? So we know he was sold as a slave and he lands up in Egypt. So already he's in a position of weakness. And then he's working for this man Potiphar, who's not just an ordinary owner of slaves, but he is a high-ranking authority, whatever he was, Sarat HaBochim, whether that is literal or euphemistic. So either he's the butcher or he's the butcher of Egypt. And he's a very senior person in Pharaoh's cabinet. So Yosef is in a very disempowered position. And Potiphar's wife comes on to him. Now, any ordinary person, let's be honest, any ordinary person who was a young person, because Yosef was sold into slavery when he was 17 years old, and the person he was sold to was Potiphar. So he's a young person. He's already experienced a certain degree of abuse at the hands of his brothers. And now he's working for this man who has tremendous power. And the woman also must have a certain amount of power. And she's coming on to him. And it's a very big temptation for Yosef. And eventually, of course, when it comes to the key moment where he has to make a decision, is he going to give in or not? At that moment, he runs for his life. And as a direct result of that, he gets thrown into prison because the wife spins a yarn and says, well, actually, he came onto her. When the Torah describes this, the Torah says that Yosef refused to sleep with her and to be with her. Now we know very well that the Torah does not repeat itself for effect. It doesn't say the same thing in different words to illustrate how broad the vocabulary is. So why does the Torah say that he refused to sleep with her, which obviously describes the nature of the seduction, and he refused to be with her? So the Gemara says what he recognized is that when a person has an intimate physical relationship with another person, it also merges their souls to a certain extent. And that's why we have such strict laws in Judaism about how relationships work, and pre-marriage and during marriage, and the sanctity of marriage, because we believe that the physical act of intimacy is also a spiritual act that forges souls together. And so Yosef realized that if he would sleep with her once, he would be with her for the rest of his soul's life. In other words, he'd now have this very deep attachment to somebody who was completely ill-suited to him, to somebody who was a negative spiritual energy. And he didn't want that. He didn't want that to schlep around with him for the rest of his soul's journey, not only in this world, but in the next world as well. And so we understand that whenever the Torah speaks about these relationships that could go awry, the Torah is talking about things that could be so profoundly spiritually damaging. And by the way, that's probably one of the reasons why we read about incest and adultery and various other prohibited relationships when on Yom Kippur. Because we're talking about a day of intimacy and holy intimacy, the intimacy between us and God. And so we read this disclaimer, this great warning about what kind of inappropriate intimacy could totally derail our intimacy with God. And everybody knows this to a greater or less extent, because everybody knows that these serious types of misbehavior are the kind of thing that a person has to avoid at all costs. So we'll use incest and adultery as obviously the most common examples. There are various other examples as well. These are things that are terribly damaging to both parties and to their children. That's why we have something called a mamzer, etc. Now we've touched on that because when we spoke about getting dragged down into the world of absolute impurity, we also were referring to somebody who engages in an inappropriate relationship. And it's not as simple for a person to do the kind of teshuvah out of love for that kind of relationship, as we shall see. We're going to explore that in the next piece. However, before we get to that, we're going to talk about another kind of behavior that is, in a sense, a mimicry of an intimate relationship, only there is no intimacy. So what are we talking about? Let's have a look. Now, I have to warn you, because there's a particular group of guys that I was learning Tanya with, I am learning Tanya with, and we are now at the end of the 30s, like chapter 38 or 39, and they're still traumatized by the next few lines that we're going to learn. So you have to appreciate that we're going to encounter something that is a very difficult concept to deal with, and it's also, I suppose, a moment for all the women in the shir where they can kind of breathe a sigh of relief and say, okay, well, this one doesn't apply to us. So what are we talking about? Ach hachayos shebetipoy zera sheyotzu mimenu levatola. So he's talking over here about something that the Torah describes early on. The Torah tells us a story. The story is that out of Yaakov's son, so actually, interestingly enough, this story is inserted in the middle of the story of Yosef going down to Egypt and being sold into slavery. So that's what we get told. We get told that Yosef was sold down into slavery. And before we get to the story of Potiphar's wife, this particular story is inserted. It's the story of Yosef's older brother. His name is Yehuda, and Yehuda gets married, and he has 3 sons. And when they come of age, he wants to find a shidduch for, well, first his oldest son, whose name was He wants to find him a shidduch. So he goes along and he finds this woman called Tamar. And he marries to Tamar. But has a bit of an issue. The issue that he has is that he's very afraid of spoiling his wife's physical beauty by making her pregnant. And so he refuses to consummate the, he effectively does what is called, what he describes over here, zera levatol, which effectively means, as the colloquial euphemistic expression goes, he spills his seed. In other words, he doesn't allow himself to conceive a child. And the Torah says as a result of that, dies prematurely. Now, because he dies prematurely, we know that one of the principles that the Torah teaches is that if a man dies without children, then we no longer practice this, but in biblical times, the wife, the widow, would then marry his brother. So now Tamar marries the brother, whose name is Oinon. But he repeats the same behavior. And so he also dies prematurely. And then there's a whole story that develops beyond that, which is not the scope of what we're going to discuss this evening, but it's basically how Yehuda is too afraid to allow Tamar to marry the 3rd son, and eventually actually she entraps him and he ends up marrying her. But that's another part of the story we're not going to focus on now. So it's at that point in time that the Torah tells us that even though nowhere in the Torah does it explicitly say, thou shall not waste seed, it doesn't say it in those words. Yet, this particular story illustrates to us that it's considered to be a very serious misbehavior. Now look what he says. For most people, particularly living in today's world, let's be honest, the concept of, you'll excuse the term, of masturbation is not something that is taboo in today's world. On the contrary, it's probably encouraged in many sectors of society. Comes along the Torah and says, whoa, hang on a second. Let's talk about this. Let's understand what's going on over here. So what does it say? The first thing it says is, we have to realize that what makes us God-like is our capacity to create. When it says that we were created in the image of God, that means that we are given the gift of being able to create. Now I know what you're going to say. You say, we're not the only ones. Every living being creates and perpetuates its own species. So what's so unique about us? So I don't know if you've ever heard of the story of the Golem of Prague. You ever heard that story? Golem of Prague? Basically, the story of the Golem of Prague, absolutely in a nutshell, is that some 200 odd years ago, there were serious issues in many European countries because of anti-Semitism and what they called the blood libel, which was effectively a way to accuse Jewish people of slaughtering Christian children to use their blood in our matzahs. And that was always used as an excuse to set off a pogrom. So there was a great mystic and rabbi of Prague at the time, the Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Loevi, who was the head of Prague at the time. And he wanted to put a stop to this, so he used a Kabbalistic incantation to literally form a being out of clay. And it became this almost, I guess, AI patrol in Prague that protected people against, firstly, the blood libels, and secondly, the pogroms that followed. When he created this being, and if you go to Prague today and you go to the Altanai Shul, which of course is the centerpiece of Jewish life still in Prague today, so upstairs in the attic, legend goes that Goylem was put to rest, was kind of, I wouldn't say buried, because it wasn't really buried, and you're not supposed to go into that space. So the one thing that the Goylem was unable to do was speak. Because only Hashem can give the gift of speech. When we have children, and our children, like us, are able to speak, they have that high functionality, that is the closest to God we'll ever get. We're creating something out of nothing. And not only are we creating something, we're creating the highest, most developed species of being. Now you might argue that angels are more developed in certain ways than we are, yes, but they cannot reproduce. So it's only the human being who's been gifted with this unique ability to produce out of nothing, out of a single cellular organism, this highly sophisticated transformational being who could actually turn the world around and could achieve communion with God. Therefore, from the Torah's perspective, the potential to create that life is already a source of life. Now that doesn't exist in the animal kingdom. It only exists in the human state. In the animal kingdom, life only begins when it's a viable fetus. But in our world, even though halachically there is scope for abortion because we don't believe that life is of the same caliber until the child is actually born, but the fact that there's the potential to create life is already considered in a certain way to be alive. Now here's where it gets really eerie. The way Hashem designed the world is that there are always interplays between what we call mashpia and mekabel. Now maybe a similar way to refer to this would be or and keli. So let's start with or and keli, but then we'll talk about mashpia and mekabel because they're not the same, but they're similar. Or is light or energy, and keli is framework or structure. So that's easy for us to understand because you have electricity that runs right through your house. When you plug in your kettle, the kettle becomes the framework that is now going to use the electricity in a very specific way. You can then unplug your kettle and plug into the same socket a Bluetooth speaker and now start playing music. So the same or can be totally different in the way that it is expressed. There's always an interplay between or and keli. If you don't have a framework, the light has no value, and if you don't have light, the framework will be dead. In a similar way, everything in life has a little bit more of an intimate connection and interplay called mashpia and mekabel. Mashpia is the giver, mekabel is the receiver. So for example, we're having a conversation right now. The nature of a conversation is at any point in the conversation, one person is being the mashpia, the person who is sharing either information or emotion, and the other person is being the mekabel, who is learning from that person or hearing what their emotional experience is. If there is no mekabel, the mashpia has got a problem. So what happens if a person starts talking and nobody's listening? They'll probably stop talking because it's so difficult to be a mashpia if there's no mekabel. But let's tweak this example slightly. What happens if the person is talking and they think nobody's listening? But actually, someone is listening. And not only is someone listening, but the worst possible person is listening. In other words, the person you're grumbling about. Or the person who accidentally sends their voice note, instead of to the person they're talking to, they send it to the person they're talking about. Right? Now you got a problem. The mashpia has invested energy in the way of words and whatever emotion was associated with those words and whatever information was embedded in those words, but that's gone to the wrong address. And if it goes to the wrong address, what's the result going to be? Chaos. Chaos. So the way Hashem designed the world is that we should have an aspiration in our lives to create, in a healthy marital environment, a mashpia and a makabel on many levels. There'll be mashpia and makabel in terms of sharing ideas, and that's a level playing field where, sometimes the husband will share ideas and the wife will listen. Sometimes the wife will share ideas and the husband will listen. Sharing of emotion. Sometimes the husband is mashpia and the wife is makabel. Sometimes the wife is mashpia, the husband is makabel. In terms of food, so typically the wife is the mashpia and the husband is the makabel. That's why anybody knows in the Hasidic world, when you go get your kapota, your frock that you wear when you get married for the first time, the tailor always makes it a few centimeters bigger than it should fit at the time. Why? Because he's anticipating there's going to be a mashpia makabel going on over here in the dining room. So, you need a bit of space. The most intimate mashpia and makabel experience is conception of a child, where the mashpia in that particular role is the male. So the male has to generate some kind of a catalyst, some kind of an energy burst that could potentially produce a child. And the female system has to be makabel. The female system has to chap that energy, hold on to that energy, and allow that energy to grow so that the child will actually manifest. Now, the interesting thing is, at the moment of conception, there is so much potential energy being released, even scientifically. We understand that in one boost, there are who knows how many millions of little, sperm, whatever you want to call them, cells. Because there's so much potential energy, and each one of those has the potential to create a whole human being. So it's like a nuclear explosion at a particular time. And the goal is then to capture that energy and translate it into an actual being. But if there is no mekabel, if there isn't a healthy recipient waiting on the other end of this experience to curate and to develop that energy into something real, you know what it says? Basic laws of physics. Energy is never lost. So if this nuclear energy is put out into the world and it is not now absorbed and held in a safe space, then it's going to go somewhere else. So although the Torah does not explicitly ban, as one of the 613 mitzvahs, ban the waste of that seed, of that potential, once we learn a little bit about what the Torah teaches, we realize how severe a choice it is. So now let's read the sentence inside the Tanya. When a person is in a situation, God forbid, they waste this potential energy, they waste their seed. So the energy goes somewhere. Doesn't just fizzle out. Where does it go? You know where it goes? It goes into the world of absolute impurity. So in other words, the person has now made an investment of life energy into poison. So let's understand this in case it sounds like maybe it's a little bit dramatic. Let's understand it this way. Let's say that there is an opportunity. There's a great opportunity, whatever the opportunity is. Let's say the opportunity is that there's a property which is available. Somebody could come in and they could get the property at a really good price, and they could then develop the property. But all the decent developers in town don't get involved. Someone's going to develop that property. So if it's not going to turn into a nice, healthy, well-maintained block of flats or townhouses or whatever it is, then it's going to turn into a slum. Because energy always goes somewhere. Well, let's put it differently. Let's say that you have a government that allocates a particular budget to a particular part of the government to run a particular program. But there's nobody there to actually run the program properly. There's no real oversight of the program. What's going to happen? The money is going to go into people's Ferraris. So when we take chayes, we take energy, and we do not direct it into a safe space, then it's going to explode out and splatter into all the wrong places. So you would now think, oy vey. The likelihood is, number one, that the average person will have failed in this area multiple times, while the average person would not have failed in things like adultery and incest. So this becomes like a little bit more of a relatable issue. This is a very commonplace issue. So number one, much more people will have fallen in this area. Number two, they would have done so many more times. So an individual could be really concerned. Here I am, I'm fueling or have fueled in the past the world of impurity. I've invested in poison. And I haven't invested money. I've invested part of my DNA into poison. Into the worst kind of poison. Sholosh klippos atmeyos. So now a person might start to panic at this point in time and say, now what? How do we get out of here? How do we fix this? How do you remove the energy that has already been allocated elsewhere? What do? You go break in, steal it all back? What exactly can you do? Let's just put this slightly differently, just for the fullness of the concept. There's this misconception, a terrible misconception, that Judaism expects that couples will only enjoy physical intimacy if they're in the game to have children. Because there's a mitzvah in the Torah to procreate, and so there's a misconception that the only reason a person has license to experience intimacy with their partner, with their spouse, is to have children. So I might remind you that belongs perhaps in a different ideology that is not Judaism. But you know what Judaism says? Every single time that a couple in the sanctity of marriage is physically intimate, a new life is born. It might not be a human baby that actually gestates for 9 months, but some kind of new life is brought into this world. And because it's in the sanctity of marriage, that new life is very healthy and positive and adds light and value to our world. By contrast, if it's outside of the sanctity of marriage, meaning to say the person doesn't have a partner, which is what we're describing, the person is wasting that potential, wasting that seed, a new life will still be created. It will just be on the other side. It will be a life of darkness, a life of toxic energy. So a person might really panic and say, how do we fix this? It's such a massive problem. It's such an endemic problem. How do we fix this? Says the Alter Rebbe, actually it's easier than we think. There are 2 steps that a person would need to follow in order to not only clean the slate, but in order to actually extract all of that energy out of the impurity and make it wholesome again. 2 steps. What are the 2 steps? Number 1, bitshuva nechoina. The first thing that the person has to do is regular teshuvah. Remorse, and of course the remorse has to be genuine. Verbal acknowledgement of the sin, that's the al-chaitz that we do. and a strong commitment not to repeat it. That's Teshuvah Nechoina. So it's fascinating, right? Because when all of the things that we've described until now, that got sucked into the world of absolute klippa, we said there's no way out unless you do this massive teshuvah. This is actually good news. That there's a particular kind of behavior which is quite widespread, where you can even use teshuvah nechoina and it will already extract the negative, the energy from the negative. But there's a second step that a person has to follow as well, and this is, I'm not going to say it's a more challenging step, but it's a less, shall we say, practiced step, and that is uvikavona atzuma b'kriyashma sha'al hamita. The second step that the person will have to follow is to have intensely focused intention when saying the bedtime Shema. Now let's be honest. Bedtime Shema, for many people, is mumbled. Because by the time we reach that part of the day, we can barely focus on anything. Let alone kavona atzuma, which is intense, absolute focus, laser-focused intention. But that's why a person has to be mindful, and a person has to be intentional, and a person has to plan to be able to have the opportunity, at least from time to time, to say the Bedtime Shema properly. So those are the two steps that completely reverse the negative impact of this wasted potential life. Teshuvah nechoina, regular, healthy teshuvah, and a very deeply focused Bedtime Shema. Kenoida meho Arizal, the Alter Rebbe says that this is something that Arizal was one of the great Kabbalists of the 16th century, speaks about in great detail, so you could obviously explore this further. Merumes b'Gemara, and this principle is also alluded to in the Gemara. The Gemara says something very interesting. It says, Kol hakoirei kriyas shema al mitosoi, any person who says the bedtime Shema, ki'ilu oiches cherev shel shtei piyos chulei, is like somebody who's going to sleep with a double-edged sword in their hand. In other words, it's there for protection. And the Gemara there quotes a particular line, which we actually in the Chabad custom actually include in the bedtime Shema, and that's the line that says that King Solomon would always go to sleep with 60 armed men surrounding his bed. Why do you need a sword when you go to sleep at night? I don't know about you, but I'd prefer not to have sharp objects around when a person is sleeping, and possibly not in control of their movements. So the Alter Rebbe explains, Laharoi gufoi sachitzoinim. What it's telling us is when a person says the bedtime Shema with focused intention, it creates a spiritual sword that is able to kill the beings that were created. These beings that kind of sabotaged and leached onto the energy that the individual put out there into the world. In other words, what he's saying is, like any other parasite, if there is nutrition around, if there's energy around, and nobody's using it, the parasite is going to take advantage of it. So there are these spiritual parasites that attach themselves to the energy that a person put out into the world through wasting their seed. Saying the Shema with that focused intention literally pries them away and destroys them. And that releases that energy so that it can realign with a healthy and holy space. So it's a really interesting topic because, as I say, for many people it's a little bit overwhelming and possibly a little bit traumatizing. But at the same time, it's fascinating because it shifts our understanding and appreciation of something which people often take lightly. And at the same time, also gives us a path to rehabilitation, which is a relief because, very often when people realize that this kind of behavior was something the Torah is so disapproving of, then the person thinks, oh my gosh, I'm stuck. So it's good to know that we have a process that we could follow. Now, we're still going to go back and contrast that against the spiritual impact of a person who has an inappropriate relationship. Here there was no other person in the relationship. What happens with adultery or incest or the likes? So that we'll still talk about in the next piece in this chapter.